Okay, welcome back. We started with the very emotional part. Now comes the more academic part. My name is Philip Aerni. I'm the director of the Center for Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability. We used to be an associated institute of the University of Zurich. Now we are associated with the School of Management Freiburg, but I'm still teaching at the University of Zurich and ETH Zurich. Our center is also a member of the Competence Center for Human Rights at the university. But the reason why we organize this is also Nyssen, my wife, who is personally involved in all this. And we were very happy that the Rote Fabrik and the Walcheturm were supporting us together with the Tigrayan community. And I really believe we have we put together an excellent panel. It's also technically challenging because 3 of the panelists will be online, or including the keynote speaker who will follow right afterwards. So I won't talk in detail about all our panelists and speakers because it would take a long time. But just to start with Jan Nyssen, he's a professor of geography at the University of Ghent. He did, during decades, research in Tigray, has a broad network there. And he used also geographical information system to make these estimations, how many casualties actually took place because of this blockade. So not including all those who died in war, but actually all the civilians who fell victim to this. So he provides a sort of a foundation with his presentation, a foundation for our discussion that will follow. And I think we have a very interesting viewpoints. We start afterwards with Charlotte Touati will follow. She looks at the whole situation from the perspective of women that were falling victim to rape and all these other tragedies we saw before. She is from the University of Lausanne, an independent researcher. Or I think you studied international relations at the University of Hamburg, and they have all very interesting biographies, but I will not be able to go into details. But she will be followed by Dr. Hagos. He is from the University of Hamburg, actually, and he's a philologist who will talk about the cultural heritage of this region. It's actually the cradle of Ethiopian civilization, and it has also been severely affected by this war. Then we will have 2 journalists who have actually done the field research. There's Samuel Misteli from NZZ, who just came back yesterday from Tigray, right?
From Nairobi. I was in Tigray 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, yes. And there is also Christian Putsch, who will be online from South Africa. He published an article in NZZ Sonntag 3 weeks ago. He was also there in the region talking to people. So we have this kind of reporting from the field. And then Thomas Cottier, I'm very happy to have him also on board, professor of international economic law, emeritus at the University of Bern, the founder of the World Trade Institute. I had the privilege to be in one of his NCCRs on international trade and sustainability, and one part was also on human rights, and he will talk a little bit about responsibility to protect. There are legal instruments to help to hold the perpetrators accountable. If that will ever happen is another question. Then finally we end with our 2 speakers from Oregon. There is Paul Slovic. He's a very famous cognitive psychologist. He published books together with Daniel Kahneman, who eventually received the Nobel Prize in economics. And over the past 10 years, he really cared about the phenomenon of mass casualties and why people remain indifferent with regard to things that happen very far away, where there's no real personal link to it. And his son Scott Slovic is a professor of literature and environment. He created this website called Arithmetic of Compassion, a platform where victims he can have a voice. I mean, the idea is really let those directly talk who are affected by this. It's not easy, but I think this is a very important and valuable platform that is now managed by him. So yes, that will be, I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. I will sometimes make some follow-up questions, but I hope we still have at the end some time for an open discussion as well. And afterwards there will be the cultural evening where we of course will socialize even more. But without further ado, I would like to hand over now to Jan Nyssen from the University of Ghent, who gives us a short introduction of what happened over the past 36 months. Thanks a lot for joining us, Jan. Can you hear us? Oh, the voice.
Yes, the mic.
Let's see.
Unmute. Okay, now I
yes. Now we hear you.
Hello, everybody. These are also many parts of Ethiopia for the moment, but that's what they did for Tigray for 2.5 years. And from time to time, telephone calls came through, and it was all about massacres, about security threats, and so on. We got information about the Aksum massacre that all of you will know now about Mahabharata massacre. That was months even before it was in the media. We were having this information, we were sharing these information. We have like more than 400 massacres in our database. There are two that we have to disqualify because there was not really a massacre. All others didn't really happen. You see some of the people who transport information to us. You have a man in Sweden there, there's Hagos behind this computer day and night, really to collect the information, shared it. We didn't limit ourselves specifically. We want to document everything that's related to the sport. And from time to time, people in the Sahara region also gave us information like this massacre that happened in Violance, where all the leadership of the national park was killed by Kanonengasse. And then now this has then, we have another base for our databases, simply what is in the media. I know there has been there has been a blockade, a media blockade, but some active journalists try to get through, and they document massacres, which we also include in our database. And the Tigray region has set up a commission of inquiry for the Tigray genocide. We hope to get their database also and to match it with ours. And so that was for civilian casualties. Another big, and of course, and even a more deadly event was the man-made famine. We had already this natural problem of the locusts who destroyed 25% of the production, but then the Ethiopian and Eritrean armies came in. There has been burning of crop fields, there has been burning of grain, there has been destruction of houses, but especially grain mills. You may have grain, you can't grind it, you can't make a flour of it, you can't make a bread. There was the blockade of food aid, which is well known. Very strong event was the preventing of plowing, and all that led to 2 years of failed crop. We have monitored that. You have published the paper, you can see it at the bottom. Our colleagues from Misteli University went to the field and went really to the farmlands and were really evaluating how is the crop stand and what are the people growing. And in 21, we were having like 20 to 50% of the land that was expected to give reasonable yields. That means that 50 to 80% of the land was giving back yields. Here you see what happened, in fact, in 2021 is that the farmers were so afraid to come out because Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers were killing farmers and were looting their oxen. So they preferred to rush away with their livestock when they saw an army coming. All this green grass that you see on the farmland for people who are not knowledgeable, it looks greenish, but in fact it are all weeds. This land should have been plowed since a long time, but it was not plowed. Here we have a photo of a very brave farmer who is then plowing his land still during the war period. But you see all the surrounding lands were left fallow and weeds were growing. And we got on this type of crops, those people who know it, if you look to the individual grains, almost none of them are filled. 2022, there was not really warfare in Tigray, but fertilizer was totally blockaded. Improved seeds and so on was totally blockaded. And they received almost 20% of the fertilizer that they needed, and it came very late. And on the photo on the right hand, you can see on the right side of the photo, this is in 2022, you see a farmland with fertilizer. On the left side, you see without fertilizer, and you see the difference that it makes. Again, this ground control data have been made available in an open access database so that people who want to continue working with these data can do it. We think we have been the only ones to collect such data in Tigray during the war. All that led to famine. And I'm presenting here some maps that some of you may know. This comes from the IPC Integrated Phase Classification. That is a large consortium that is monitoring basically the status of famine and farming activities all over the world. And you see on the left map, Tigray in October 2020, before the war started, in greenish color, minimal food insecurity. And you see 1 year later, you see all the red colors, it corresponds to emergency and famine. That's why we say it is a man-made famine. The rain was good in 2020, the rain was good in 2021, the rain was good in 2022. So it's not, rainfall was not because of this emergency food insecurity. And we can continue throughout 2022, we get similar type of maps. This type of maps we have used to calculate famine deaths, because with every of these phases of the IPC, there's that rate that is associated. I mean, when you go into the reddish color, for example, number 4 is the emergency. It means 1 to 2 famine deaths per 10,000 people per day. Yeah, you take a town of 10,000 people, 1 or 2 people will die from hunger every day, and 2 to 4 for the under 5. And then what we then did was to take all these maps, but behind these maps, of course, there are tabulated data that are available that we could use. And we calculated the number of famine deaths. Here you see in orange at a certain time. Only Misteli was in crisis with a relatively low number of death rates, but then the other red areas were in emergency, 2 to 4 deaths per 10,000, and there were pockets of famine which were accounted for with over 4 people per 10,000 dying per day. And then it's a matter of doing statistical calculations, calculating weighted averages, which needed to be weighted area-wise and over the duration of the road. Brings us to, sorry, to a lot of statistical juju, where what I'm giving here is an equation, but there are huge Excel tables behind all that to do the calculations, which brings us then to using the data from IPC. That's the only thing we have for extrapolation, that we get a minimum famine death rate of 246,000 and a maximum of 542, and probably somewhere in between. And one can do the same calculation for the mortality. You know that if we can say a lot of bad things about the EPRDF party, but one strong thing that they did was to bring Ethiopia down to a death rate of 6 per 1,000 people, natural deaths per year. This is at the same level as Europe. Of course, Europe has an old population. That's also why we have a relatively higher death rate. But this comes down from 24 or 26 at the moment when EPRDF came to power. And somehow this is the merit of not only Tedros, but Tedros and his team to have brought down this natural death rate extremely to 6 per 1,000. And now you go back, since the war started, to something very bad, where hospitals are not working. Hospital staff didn't get salary, so they moved out to their family to live on the farm with their parents in order to have some food. Medicine was blockaded, vaccines were blockaded. We know people who have died because there was no vaccine for rabies. They were bitten by a dog and they died. And then, so what we did here was to calculate a surmortality, an estimated current mortality minus the natural death rate that was there. And again, becomes something around 100,000 people who died due to this total collapse of the health sector. And then the overall death toll was then calculated as the sum. And of course, there has been throughout this war near absence of communication. The Ethiopian government has been very efficient in shielding off Tigray from the outside world. In addition, they were doing blackmailing of NGOs who have a vision on the situation. But if NGOs speak out, their staff can get killed. That's happened, like Mid-Sessa here. Or the organizations are expelled from Ethiopia. So they shut up to be able to continue to work. We have then or estimate between 300 and 800,000 civilian deaths. We have to add to these civilian deaths the people who died in the Afar and the Amhara region. It's a bit more difficult to calculate because these regions, that the war front has moved over these regions, but Afar and Amhara region have never been blockaded like Tigray has been blockaded. And of course, the battlefield, that is another horrible picture. And then we see that different diplomats, like the American ambassador to the United States, come also with such a 500,000 figure. You know, this ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, she is not a junior ambassador who picks up something that Jan Nyssen is saying to impress the UN. They have their feedback from the American embassy in Addis Ababa. Similarly, when Joseph Borrell comes up with 800,000 deaths, they have their own ways of bringing these numbers. So we are all a bit in the same, unfortunately, in the same order of magnitude. For ourselves, we wanted to do some empirical verification, and we have done together with Misteli University an intense field campaign in January 2023. In the middle photo, you see our colleagues who went to the field in one district, Dogatembe, and that's even a district that was not too bad as compared to many other districts. The front moved only once through the district. And we did 35 interviews with 101 persons. And it is all a bad story about looting, destruction, starvation, famine, and people will tell you that we have an unseen, miserable life. It's even worse than during the time when during their time, there was no fertilizer, we got no aid, or harvest failed, etc. And that leads to people selling off their assets, not only their gold and their jewelry, but also selling off their oxen at a very cheap price, 7,000 birr for one ox. And with 7,000 birr, you can buy 50 kilograms of grain. So that indicates very clearly, imagine that ox, what it has eaten over its life, and now you get 50 kilograms of grain for that ox. So that situation of the people in Tigray is very catastrophic. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready for the debate. You can always consult our website with the civilian casualties like it is indicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was really very impressive presentation. You did really your research. But there are some people who argue that, well, you don't look at the counterfactual scenario, how many would have also died. And then there's always the argument, well, there used to be a food emergency in Sudan. There was one in Somalia. How do you respond to this argument that
I've shown you one of these? It's obvious. Tigray is a semi-arid area. They have done very big efforts over the last 20 years to improve the agricultural system, among others with the fertilizer, also all the soil and water conservation activities, and they were balanced. It was not really excess production, but it was balanced, and you can see that on the map that I have shown you for October 2020. There was no food insecurity at that moment. If that is also because the rain has been good, but the rain has also been good during the war. In years with insufficient rainfall, Tigray plunges into food insecurity. But we didn't have that. So I'm saying this is a man-made famine. This is not a natural famine.
And how is the probability that the perpetrators might ever be accountable according to your view? You mentioned the commission on genocide, but you know also the opposition to it, right?
But I'm even not having the discussion about genocide, because sometimes it is a bit theoretical discussion. But the casualties are there. Organizing a blockade of a region, and just to remind people, the blockade of Tigray is something very different from let me call it a soft blockade of Cuba or Iran. Ships can go to Cuba, ships can go to Iran. There can be trade, airplanes can go, people can travel, a lot of difficult conditions. But in Tigray, it's totally blockaded. It was totally blockaded from all sides. The people in Tigray were telling us, if Abiy could shut down the sun, he would have shut down the sun also. So or he would have cut off or oxygen or the air masses moving over Tigray also.
I know we need to move on.
So it was a very extreme blockade, and that's a war crime. You may not, even if the civilian population is supporting the Tigray forces, you may not organize a blockade and starve all these people to death in order to win the war. So that was a war crime. Now, what is the probability that they get? You know, they are a bit blackmailing. They try to blackmail again Europe and the US and the UN system. They try to prevent this international committee of experts on Ethiopia to continue to do their work on human rights recording. But we will see to what extent will internationally give.
I'm sure we will discuss that also at the end again. It's very good.
I think so, yes.
And my argument is Mengistu did the same thing in the 1980s with this food blockade. Stalin did it in the Ukraine, so-called Holodomor. But has there been ever accountability? That's the challenge. But we will discuss this later on. But we have to move on to our next panelist, which will be Charlotte Touati. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
And you also have a few slides, or are you?
No, I would speak.
Very good. So please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Hopla. I'm quite. So thank you for being here. So I'm here today as an historian because I would never thought that I have to face concentration camp again in this century. People hunted down because of not because of what they did, but because of what they are. Simply because of what they are. Because what happened in Tigray, just as Professor Jan told just earlier, is a plain genocide. In the historical etymological sense of the word, which is in its Latin roots, gens occidere, which means to kill a nation, to kill a people. And it is in this framework, in the ideological framework, that we must understand the use of rape as a weapon of war. So rape, sadly, is probably as old as humanity, as old as war. But there is, on the legal, also on the legal ground, there is a different interpretation. You can have any rape is a crime, but you can have common law crime. Imagine in a wartime context, maybe some soldier go out of the barracks and and decided on their own will to rape someone. And you have the weaponized rape, which is a war crime, when the difference in when the soldier are ordered to act so, to rape people. And in this context, in Tigray, we can interpret it, understand it as the use of rape as genocide strategy. We can, from the very beginning of the war, in November 2020, the men were hunted down and killed in a very systematic way. And the women were raped or mutilated. The goal was to prevent them from having, as they call it, Woyane baby. The goal is just to eradicate a people. So I begin quite early to work with the Tigrayan refugees in Sudan. Because of the blockade, we couldn't reach the victims inside Tigray. So we began to work with the refugees in Sudan. And I frequently heard some victims saying that their rapists told them, "We will have an Amara baby." This was quite common to hear that. And we can make a typology, very horrific typology, between, in fact, the rape committed by Abraha or Ethiopian, saying this kind of thing, and the Eritrean. On the Eritrean side, we heard more words on retaliation and prevent the Tigrayan women to give boys to the junta. We can make this kind of difference, but the goal was always the same. It was to prevent women to have babies or make them have Amara's babies. So I began to document the rape and to record the victims of rape in Sudan in order to set a legal action on the universal jurisdiction for war crime. But because I frequently read on the social media that Abiy or Isaiah should go to the ICC, at the ICC, but it's just not legally possible because neither Ethiopia nor Eritrea signed the Rome Statute. Technically, it could be possible to have a domestic legal process in Ethiopia, but still, since Gideon Timotheus is the Minister of Justice, it's just science fiction. So we decided to find the most suitable jurisdiction, probably in Europe. We must find a prosecutor who wants to seize this case. But I have to say that we will slow down due to the war in Ukraine. Everybody has the eyes on Ukraine, and maybe we have to wait a little bit. But justice will prevail. Justice is slow. And there is a real need, there is a real emergency situation, and we need to help this woman. This is knowing what I was doing. The Archbishop of Adigrad, His Holiness Tesfacial Medin, excuse me, reached me, and we decided to develop something in the Adigrad diocese healthcare network to welcome the victim of the of weaponized rape when the blockade will be lifted. So I think I'm really moving quite now, and we are preparing the contextualization of the holistic model of care developed in Congo by the Dr. Mukwege, the 2018 Peace Nobel Prize. He's a very famous gynecologist. And we plan to develop, we began to develop the assistance to the victim, especially in the Kidani Mehet Hospital in Adwa. The goal is to assist the women, because it's mostly women, with the medical assistance, mental health care. Also, because being a victim is not an identity, it's not also a job. So we need to see, we must see these women come back to the society. So it will be also social workshop and also a legal assistance. Because what is clear in the use of rape as a weapon of war in Tigray is not only the women were targeted in their bodies, but also the whole society. So if you want to see long-lasting peace in Tigray, we need to face this problem for the whole society, men included, because it's not only a women problem. Because we estimate that 120,000 women were victims of rape during these conflicts. Very sadly, it seems that it is not finished, that there are still Eritrean troops or Amhara militiamen on the ground committed crimes, and we need to assist them. So we need also the help of people of the international community in the diaspora. We have the project described here. You have also copies outside. If you want, maybe, but we have very numerous panel, but maybe we can come back if you have question. I can answer any question of our method, how we document the kind of question, the file we are preparing, and also I have thousands of testimony. Each day, I think I heard the worst, but each time is worse again. The assaulters are just incredibly creative in cruelty. Guys, what do you have in mind? Honestly, it's incredible. Probably you read some testimonies in the newspaper. I can tell you some here, but it is quite very disturbing. I don't know if you have more precise question or you...
No, go ahead. I think it's a very, very important initiative that has to be supported, the Mukwege Foundation. And it's really something that the BBC documentary did not talk about, all the scandal of rape, and to use it in a systematic way to really cause the psychological damage to society, to make it capitulate. And ultimately, the capitulation was related to the fact that people are just killed by masses and they are abandoned by the international community. So what can they do? And that's really that's the biggest scandal in my view, that there was this indifference towards all these tragedies, especially also with regard to this dimension of rape. And so we will discuss that.
Yes, I can speak about that, because yes, we say some prosecutor, and so for some political reasons, they won't say the file. Also, but it's quite geopolitical. I can speak a lot of geopolitical problem, because you know Ethiopia is Ethiopia, and you know what is Ethiopia in Africa. So especially I think, with the French. They don't want to cut the relation with Ethiopia because they need the votes of the other African country in the UN. So for now, on the legal ground, we have little expectation.
Thanks a lot. And we will talk about this later on again.
Yeah.
Now we have to move, and this time we have a representative from Ethiopia who is actually working in Hamburg, and he will talk about another dimension that is not covered in the BBC documentary, namely the destruction of cultural heritage that happened during the war. He's our guest in our apartment, and he found this book. I mean, I found it in an antiquity store in Zurich, and my wife looked at it and she said, "This doesn't belong here. Buy it." And now he looked at it and he found it's a very valuable psalm book from a monastery in the Tigray region. But I leave it by that and hand over the word to Dr. Hagos.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay. Before I talk about the destruction and damage of cultural heritage in Tigray, I would like to emphasize what is or what are the meanings of those cultural heritage materials in Ethiopia, mainly in identity branding. So, okay. Ethiopia as a country has more than 3,000 years history, recorded history, and most of the historical values are out of Tigray, and that's why Tigray is rich in cultural heritage materials, mainly during the antiquity time, which means from the 3rd to the 7th century. The Aksumite civilization, which was one of the climax civilizations around the globe with China, Persia, and Rome, there was production of literacy and the church, and also the heritage materials. The production of Islam, which has branded Ethiopia and then influenced even the other side of the Red Sea, including the Quranic Arabia. Today we find lots of Ge'ez words in Quran because that was one of the prosperous culture around East Africa. So not only in the church and religion, but also in politics, almost all Ethiopian kings up to 1974 were crowned in Aksum, the Church of Zion, which is believed to be the dwelling of the Ark of the Covenant, and it's the head of churches and monasteries today in Ethiopia. And so today, the values that Ethiopia is proud about are originally, not all of them, of course, but predominantly are from Tigray. So the Church of Aksum and other monasteries, like the monastery of Debre Damu, which was established in the 6th century, and the arrival of the 9th saints after the Council of Chalcedon and Rome, has influenced Christianity around the whole sub-Saharan Africa. So Christianity was introduced early on, even based on some accounts. We believe that it was introduced from the very beginning at the time of Jesus, because we have some accounts in Greek, like Thomas the hymnographer has recorded that Saint Thomas in Matthew has visited Aksum or Ethiopia, but at least during the beginning of the 4th century, the Ethiopian or the Aksumite king Izana was converted into Christianity. Not only in Christianity, but also Islamic religion. The first followers of Muhammad had to come or had to flee from the Quraysh persecution, and they were hosted in today's Tigray And this is the symbol for the first introduction of Islamic religion into the whole Africa before the Quran was composed, for that matter. So the literary production of is also the production of manuscript heritage. Like we have a manuscript which is dated to 330 up to 660 during the Common Era, which is the oldest surviving Christian manuscript. So all this production or the prosperous religious, political culture of Ethiopia and beyond in East Africa was branded by those values which were from Tigray. So that's why Tigray is so important in cultural heritage materials that belong not only to Tigray, but also to Ethiopia and beyond and to the globe. But those heritage materials today have been targeted, or they are being cleansed. And the heritage materials that are targeted are the heritage icons, like churches and the mosques were targeted. For example, the Aksumite church, the massacre in Aksum, has haunted a lot of Christian civilians, but also interrupted a well-known monthly supplication of the Christian civilians that they do every 7 days of the month. So it was a total humiliation and intimidation of the religious icons. And also, as you can see in the image, the Al-Najash Mosque, which is a symbol for the introduction of Islam into Africa, was bombed by the invading forces. Most of the heritage destruction were committed by Eritrean forces and Amhara special forces, followed by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. So these are some of the examples. We cannot present every damage within 10 or 20 minutes, but these are just samples. And the monastery of Waldiba, for example, which is the biggest monastery in the whole East Africa, and it's according to the local tradition, hagiographical tradition, Jesus and his family during the journey to Egypt has visited this monastery. Just it's to show how this monastery is venerated, and this monastery is not only a monastery of monks, but it's also a desert of hermit. And then it's also a symbol of symbiosis of monks from all over Ethiopia and Eritrea. So more than 1,000 nuns, monks and nuns have been living there. But those Tigrayan monks have been exclusively or singled out, and they were killed while praying in the monastery. Like, as monks do not have citizenship, that they don't belong to any ethnicity, as Saint Paul said, that they believe or they say that their ethnicity or their home is in the heaven. But to your wonder, monks who are believed to be from Tigray ethnicity were exclusively persecuted. So more than 13 monks were killed, and hundreds of them were exiled to many other monasteries. And some of them have been asking an asylum to the other monastery, which is called Mer'awei Christos in Western Tigray. Of course, many other manuscripts and monks from the other monastery were also killed. Not only so there are lists of churches, like hundreds of churches and monasteries were damaged, or directly or indirectly. Some of them could be casually, and some others were intentionally devastated. So these are some of the lists of churches, and this is just preliminary assessment about the damage. Of course, it's published in many other sources because they have been documenting the heritage, cultural heritage damage since the war started, because I have also been in Tigray during the first 3 months of the war, and I was consulting the people who had satellite telecom in the ground, and from the survivors of the genocide. So we have only samples of lists of churches, otherwise there are hundreds of monasteries and churches. Not only churches and monasteries were destroyed, but also manuscripts, ancient manuscripts were damaged, burned down, and looted. So thousands of precious ancient manuscripts that could be so significant for historical records and also for the emotional and religious values of the society, mainly the clergy and the were damaged or were taken away. So these are samples. For example, the one which is destroyed here is from Eastern Tigray, and the other one is from Marawi Christos, which was looted. It's just a sample, otherwise there are hundreds and sometimes thousands of manuscripts. Actually, there are more than 700,000 manuscripts in Ethiopia in general, according to scientific study. And most of the archaic and big amount of the number of the manuscripts are preserved in mountainous and wilderness of the Tigrayan churches and monasteries. Some of the looted manuscripts have been popping up into different e-commerce shops in the Western countries and also in neighboring countries like in Kenya and Sudan. This manuscript, which is the Book of Psalms, also other manuscripts. Of course, it's not during the war, but this is one of the examples that might have been looted. And then this is bought by Negesti or Philip, one of you. And just they were thinking to donate back to Ethiopia, to Tigray, or to the place that it belongs. So I come across to the manuscript, this precious manuscript. I have been describing it. It's so wonderful. And I have dated it also. So this is just a simple example that many other manuscripts and ecclesiastical materials have been looted and taken. Like eBay, for example, last year, there were like hundreds or some of them with expensive prices. But what UNESCO, ECOM, or other, the Interpol, or other like Blue Shield companies are doing about cultural heritage materials, specifically to Ethiopia or Tigray, whatever, it's almost nothing. And it's not only manuscripts, and it's also archaeological sites. This is assumed to be the palace of Queen of Sheba. It's one of the significant archaeological sites of our ancient historical record, but it was bombed, as you can see. Museums and memorial places like the Palace of Emperor Johannes of the 19th century, and also the Martyrs Museum of Tigray Revolutionary Party, or during the 1980s. So they were damaged. They are in Mekelle city, and those museums and palaces were damaged during the time that there was no war in Mekelle. So also guardians of heritage, the priests, clergies were persecuted. This report, like 326 clergies or priests were killed only during the first 3 months of the war. This is according to the report of the Tigrayan Orthodox Church Diocese. But we don't know how many more priests and clergies were killed within the more months we have now. So they were fleeing to monasteries and churches as sanctuary or asylum, which is a tradition in Ethiopia, mainly in Tigray. But even the monastery, the asylum, the sanctuary couldn't save them. So they were totally blocked three-dimensionally. They cannot like communicate with their people. They are blocked from the international society, but still they could not pray to their God because their supplication places, monasteries, churches were invaded, or they were denied their own spiritual settings. So why we say it is intentional is that we have lots of massacres, priests or civilians, whatever, massacres like in Aksum or in Iha, in Devra Abai, in Mahavira Dago, and many of them were persecuted during Christmas Day in 2020. And also the massacre of Aksum was committed like 2-3 days before the anniversary day of the Saint Mary Zion, which is so popular festivity. Many international people visit this festivity, but also from within the country and region. So the important icons, values, tangible heritages, and intangible values were intentionally targeted. And according to the UNESCO Draft Policy 2021, and also according to the International Criminal Law Policy, published recently in 2021, the heritage material rights or cultural heritage rights are as equivalent as human rights. So, like, what's the meaning of life without cultural value, whether it's modern or not? To the specific and contextual setting of a certain society, a cultural value is all about the emotional means of life. So, like, people need to exist, but still also to live. And life is beyond existence. Why? Because it has its own emotional values that has been substantiated by the cultural, linguistic, religious, belief, whatever values. So Tigrayans have been denied those materials. So it's all about living with a meaningful life. So at last, the international community, I always question why this genocide or cleansing is invisible. That's the question that it matters today. Yeah, I don't know. We will talk later now. I'm sorry to take a lot of time, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. A very informative talk, and also the question is, Abiy Ahmed, he has this vision of creating a new society, and it looks increasingly as if the Orthodox Church is his enemy, right? It's representing the past, and he wants to have a future. How do you see that? And why are Christians in Europe so indifferent towards Ethiopia? I mean, this manuscript, it's just ending up in an antiquity store. No one knows what the content is. You enlightened us. And so this disconnectedness, in my view, it's also a little bit of a scandal, right?
Yeah, regarding the European Christians, it's very difficult to answer to me because it will be so reductive and conclusive to me, but I would guess I would expect that the European Christians would be concerned about the human aspects, and of course it's connected with the religion too, but like some of the Christian values might have been influenced by secularism and with less emotional values, as the values that are viewed like in Tigray. For example, this manuscript in Europe is, I'm sorry if I'm very categorical, could be like historical record, precious material, and heritage, and so on. But in Tigray, there can be a ritual that has connected with the healing power of a certain barren lady, so that she could be fertile, or the value of a certain heritage material could have as value of, as if like the value of intercession with God, or with a certain diet that they believe. So our society, even though our society is have writing system, literate, and so on, but still we are in a life when we are more connected with emotional, cultural. I'm sorry, I will be categorical. So, and secondly, secondly, they might have not enough information, honestly, like what we could see in Ukraine because of the geographical distance and other issues. But most importantly, and obviously, an issue in the global south is looked at secondary in the Western world. That's more than obvious.
That's also one thing we will discuss later on. Why is it treated so differently from Ukraine? But I think we are already a little bit behind. So let's move on to the people who have experience in the field, namely two journalists. I'm very happy that Samuel Misteli is here from NZZ. I suggest we start with your statement and then we move to Christian Putsch online. Or shall we do it the other way around? Okay. She's the boss, so she decides. Very good. Okay, let's move to Christian. Welcome. I hope we hear you well. But
yeah, I hope you hear me as well. Wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I was in Tigray mid-January, so a couple of weeks ago. I spent a total of 2 weeks in Ethiopia, 4 days of those in Tigray, and I started my visit to Ethiopia by covering a visit of the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, who was there for 2 days, and yeah, she spoke to all the important people, to Ahmed Abiy, obviously, some other people, African Union, and she left without speaking to any ethnic Tigrayan after those 2-3 days, and so no voice of Tigray was heard. I mean, one could argue it would have been a bit tricky to push for a visit to Tigray at this stage, but when one could have expected at least some sort of contact to Tigrayans. So it was a bit difficult to get to Tigray at the time. I'm sure Samuel will second that feeling. It wasn't impossible though. You couldn't book flights online. So it took some improvisation on the ground, but I think if the Ethiopian Secret Service would have wanted me to stop the trip, or would have actually wanted to stop me, they could have done it. So even though they officially don't allow journalists, there are ways, and there seems to be not the final will to kind of stop journalists from covering the conflict now. So that was maybe one positive side. So I went, and I was mainly interested in two questions. Number one, obviously, the effect of the peace agreement. What is really happening on the ground? What can be seen? What kind of autocracies can still be witnessed? And then, obviously, I was also interested in following up on the genocide claims, and also the extreme magnitude of the numbers that Nyssen and his team have researched and calculated, which obviously played a huge role to even put this conflict on the map. It would have been probably even more difficult to cover this conflict and to create some sort of awareness in the West had it not been for his work. So I think, the Tigrayan community really owes him a big thank you. So I arrived. Mekelle, as most of you know, has hardly been, let's say, destroyed. I mean, very, very little destruction during the war. It seemed like more and more goods were arriving again. Internet had just been restored. Ethernet had set up Signal again. It obviously doesn't help a lot in the rural areas where most of the cell phone towers have been destroyed. But so outside of Mekelle, it is still a big issue. But for instance, if you went into the hotel had just been reconnected to the internet the day before, and the lobby was full of people, at least 100 people, I would say, who used that Wi-Fi signal to make contact to probably some of you people in the room, like people they haven't spoken to in 2 years, trying to connect to relatives who fled to Sudan. A rather normal situation, obviously, with a lot of personal drama, if you look closer. But again, it was reconnected at the time. Only some of the banks had reopened. It was still very difficult to do business because the major bank that most businesses were using had not been reconnected. I'm not 100% sure if that has happened yet. But Mekelle, obviously a different situation than the rural areas. I want to follow up on the previous panelists speaking about rape victims. I went to Ida Hospital in Mekelle and spoke to a very upset nurse called Bulu. Some might have heard the name. She's very active. She's absolutely amazing. She has treated more than 2,000 rape victims since the beginning of the war. To my disgust, she said that many of these rape victims had appeared and shown up after the peace agreement in November. So that is obviously a very sobering information. She said partly it was because those victims had access to the routes that led to Mekelle, so they could come. But she actually introduced me to a lady called Selam, who had only been raped 10 days before I met her by 2 Eritrean soldiers right at the border between Tigray and Eritrea. Her grandmother was shot in front of her eyes. She was raped by 2 men before she lost consciousness. And when she woke up, her 10-year-old daughter was missing. So one of the toughest interviews I have ever done, I must say. So that happened early January. The information she gave was so accurate and so full of details, terrible details, that I really I would consider a very, very credible statement from her. And Sister Mulu, the nurse, she actually mentioned that many cases were still coming in. It was at the time when Eritrea still occupied quite a number of big cities in the north. Only when I left, more and more reports were coming in that they are leaving the cities. Maybe Samuel will have fresher evidence on that a bit later. So that was terrible. I spoke to other rape victims there as well. Some who had tried to commit suicide. Some who really suffered from not being able to connect to their relatives, not knowing if your children are still alive. I mean, the trauma there is absolutely unspeakable. It also leads me to the big question of transitional justice that has to be discussed now. Obviously, I highly doubt that they will involve Europe in any way. I highly doubt that they will involve people from outside Africa, if at all. The government obviously treats it as an internal matter. And I spoke to, when I was still in Addis, I spoke to a state prosecutor who had just quit his job because he said it's not justifiable anymore to do this kind of job when there's clear evidence that people are prosecuted simply due to their ethnicity. So he had left, and he asked the question: how can the one party that is probably the main culprit in the terrible numbers that had to die, how can they be in charge of prosecuting the wars? And he also mentioned an example. There was some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission between 2018 and 2021, which had to kind of deal with ethnic tensions, and that was basically a failure. So they stopped their work recently, and he said that alone is proof enough that the efforts that were made by the Ethiopian government to prosecute crimes committed between ethnic groups is simply not working and credible. So then I went to a village, Tashi. It's about 60 kilometers southwest of Mekelle. Obviously, when you drive there, you see destroyed tanks along the way. You see destroyed schools, terrible pictures of destruction. Destroyed schools, obviously, a massive problem as well. Students went right from not being able to go to school because of COVID to not being able to go to school because of the war, right? So it's for 3 years there was no schooling in Tigray, which is obviously affecting an entire generation. I went to that village where I heard that there was at the beginning of the war, and spoke to the chief. He mentioned that during the 5 days the ENDF was there together with Fano. About 50 people in the area died from basically being killed. And supporting what Jan said earlier, in the 2 years that followed, 250 more died from the indirect effects of the war, like basically failed harvests, lack of medicine, all of the terrible things that were due to the blockade. I asked him how much people are living there. About 11,000. He also added like the areas surrounding Tashi to that. So that would mean that about every 30th citizen has passed away. I'm fully aware that some of the other areas were more affected, like the west and the north. I also want to add that many of the citizens fled after the massacre, so it's very difficult to tell how many more have died. But it would maybe be a small beacon of hope that the numbers were a little bit lower than the calculations of Jan Nyssen, who, if they are accurate, which there's plenty of evidence for, it would mean that 10% of the population has passed away. So it makes it, in my opinion, very, very important that a lot of independent research will be done there to follow up on the crimes. So yeah, that's maybe it from in a nutshell from me. I must say it was a very depressing 4 days. A lot of trauma also going into the IDP camps. I said it to Philip in the other day. I've hardly ever seen so many people cry within 4 days. Trauma laying bare, right? I mean, there's no psychological support at all. Just before this panel, I saw that Gutierrez announced a visit apparently to come to Tigray next week, as well as visiting Afar and Amhara, which I think is long overdue. And I hope it will bring some more pressure to deal with what happened there, because this can't go unnoticed. And I think the people there deserve justice. They deserve to tell their stories, and a proper transitional justice, which I think is not in place at the moment and not in sight at all. So yeah, I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea. If you have
Thanks
further
a lot.
questions,
Thanks a lot, Christian. That was
wonderful.
really a touching statement from your side. Maybe also applause for his field research. Unfortunately, I have only very little time now because we are really behind. So I just pass the word on to Samuel Misteli, who also has his field experience, and it will be very interesting to see to what extent his impressions coincide with your impressions. Thanks a lot for coming, Samuel.
Okay. Is it working with the photo? Yes, good. So I was there. I think I was there 1 week after Christian. And what I did is, so I was able to move around a bit. I was able to move quite freely in the areas that are currently held by the TDF, that are under control of the Tigrayan government. And so I visited some places west and north of Mekelle, and what we ended up doing was basically we were looking into some stories. We were in the end looking into some war crimes. And so the article I wrote hasn't, for those who read my paper, it hasn't been published yet. It was supposed to be published this week, but it has been pushed back to Tuesday. But it should be published on Tuesday. So I wanted to show some pictures. So what you see when you move around on the roads, it's, I mean, you see a lot of traces, obviously, of the war. You see a lot of damaged buildings. You see a lot of those vehicles that have been hit by drones or other weaponry, and that are just there on the road. So yeah, so the war is like very, very visible everywhere. You also see like some signs of a return to, I don't know, normalcy, some kind of, you see in Mekelle, for example, you see people doing exercise, running. I saw one cyclist outside of Mekelle who was like exercising. You also see like a lot of probably the most impressive thing was that it's, I mean, you can't make a step without encountering stories of the war, or without, I mean, you can speak basically to any person in Tigray at the moment that has a story to tell, or several stories to tell about the war, because it has been so comprehensive that like everyone was affected. Just this woman, just an example, that's in a village maybe an hour and a half away from Mekelle, and she's where a big battle was, and her son, he was injured by a mine. So that's also, I think, something that that's not that well known, but there have also been mines, and he, for example, he was injured when kids were playing close to the village. Yes, there also this, you also see, when I say you see some signs of a return to normalcy, you also see reconstruction. You see, for example, these people rebuilding houses. You see entire villages where you see a lot of reconstruction. The village basically been flattened by now rebuilding going on. That is around an hour from Mekelle West in Alassa, I think. Yes, and then one thing also, you see a lot of fighters. That's also something I found very impressive, because the Tigrayan forces, they're everywhere now, because they're back from the front lines, and so they're in all the towns and villages, and it looks like basically half of Tigray is under weapons, or it is in is part of the military. So it's still very much a region in a military state. So those guys there, those are TDF fighters north of Bukro, for those who know Tigray, like around an hour, a bit more than an hour north of Mekelle. And those are more fighters. Those are some fighters we spoke to about peace, about about the war. I can, if people have questions later on, I'm happy to speak more in detail. So then, as I said, what we did is look into some episodes of the war. This is in Adikoilo. It's also about a bit more than an hour from Mekelle, where one of the massacres happened still in the first weeks of the war. And this guy is Salih Seged is his name, and he's what he did there. He's showing us where bodies were found in the village. Among them, his father. His father was found next to the tree that you can see up there. And it was when Ethiopian and Eritrean forces were advancing, and they were just shooting civilians. Among them, several priests in that village, and also in the surrounding villages. I think there were around 40 people killed in that village and the surrounding villages. Then I wanted to show these pictures quickly because we were talking about cultural heritage. This is a church in Nagash that you will know for sure. And the priests there were showing us the destruction at the church. You can see it was bombed by a tank. So you see the destruction up on the roof. Yeah. And this is those are wall paintings that have been torn down and thrown outside of the church. Those are the priests that were showing us around. And this is inside, where there's still you can see the marks of the shelling, and there's also some remnants of the shelling that is still there. It's also something you find it in many places in Tigray. You still find like remnants of shelling. Then one last thing I wanted to mention was that I think hasn't been mentioned. That was much. We also looked into. I wanted to look into something towards the end of the war, before the peace agreement, and we went to Abiy Adi, which is the town that you also saw in the documentary, where they went to the first hospital they went to with the malnourished children. And what happened in Abiy Adi towards the last weeks of the war, there were several drone attacks that killed. I don't have a number, but that killed several dozen people. And this, what you see there in the image, is one house that was hit by a drone attack, and where a woman and her 2-year-old boy died. And it's something. It's something strange because those drones, those are the Turkish drones that you might have read about, that showed up especially towards the end of the war, and those are like it's precision ammunition, and it's strange that they shouldn't go wrong actually, and unless there's like a technical failure or so. But in Abiy Adi there were several incidents where you had killings like this one. One we also looked into was there was also in the last days there was a truck that was hit right in the middle of town, where can you stop there? So there was a truck hit, and there were around 20 people were killed, and on the truck there were fighters but also civilians, and that kind of thing happened there towards the end of the war. And you can see the remnants of the bombs. They are still, I mean, that's in the house where we were. It's still lying around, and also in the middle of town where we with the truck that was bombed. Also, you had the same things still around. Just also to make the point again how visible everything still is. Yes, so those are the neighbors that found the woman that was killed in that attack. They're standing inside her house. Yeah. So just to sum this up, so I found it like very impressive how, in a way, how ever present the war. It's like in everything. It's like it's visible. It's in the story, and like it's all encompassing, maybe, because just everyone has been been affected. And what also I was kind of asking myself, well, what kind of peace is this now, or is this peace what's there now? And I don't really have an answer for that, but something I found really impressive is that, or probably the phrase I heard most during the days I was there for a little less than a week, so the phrase I heard most was people were saying, so at least now we can sleep in peace again. We couldn't sleep in peace for 2 years, and now we can sleep in peace again, which doesn't sound like much, but I think for many people that's already really a lot. That it means a lot already to just be able to sleep in peace again.
Thank you very much for this statement. Yes, I think it very much confirms a little bit what Christian Putsch was also observing. I mean, and what we haven't really discussed, all the long-term damage, right? So children who couldn't go to school for 3 years, who were malnourished, this will be this will have a long-term impact we cannot even anticipate at the moment. That's also an issue we will have to discuss later on. But I guess I have to move on to the last speaker, who is offline here, Thomas Cottier. I'm very happy that you were able to join. You're not a specialist on the Tigray, but you're a specialist on international economic law, but also on international human rights law. So it will be very interesting from you to see what kind of possibilities are there to make people accountable, to create a reconciliation commission or whatever it is. And so, yeah, I hand over the floor to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Philip and Nigas, for this opportunity and to help us raise awareness about this out-of-sight war. You asked me just to provide a brief assessment under international law of the situation. And of course, the starting point is this is primarily an internal strife. This is the strife between a federal government and one of their federate states who tries to break out or negotiate special conditions here. And of course, then Eritrea comes in, and then it becomes an international dispute. And I will come back to Eritrea later on, but let's look at the internal situation first. Many people would say this is an internal affair. There's nothing of your concern. Keep out. Well, that's not true, because Ethiopia is a signatory of the Convention on where is it? Genocide. Sorry, I'm a bit emotional after all these statements here. So they are a signatory of this genocide convention, and they can be held accountable here. Now, unlike in the case of Ukraine and Russia, where a case was now brought and is pending before the International Court of Justice, it probably will be difficult to find a claimant who actually brings Ethiopia before the International Court of Justice. But it's not excluded, because any state is entitled to do that, not just the state affected. And if we look at now the policies pursued in respect to Russia, where Russia will be held accountable, and that's what governments pledge, they probably have to be consistent and do the same thing also with other parts of the world here. And so that is something which needs to be built up here. But I think perhaps the more promising route to take as an approach is what we call responsibility to protect. This is R2P. This is a concept which evolved early in the century and was adopted by the United Nations in 2005. And essentially, it is a supplement to the genocide convention. And the purpose of R2P is to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So it's a broad concept. And other than going the court route, it essentially puts the responsibility on the state in the first place. So today, under R2P, it's the responsibility of the central government in Ethiopia to keep the peace vis-a-vis the international community, to keep access open for food supplies, to keep access open for medicines, etc. And the international community would monitor this here. Now, what is important is if the federal government is not in a position to provide such security and to, under national sovereignty, exercise its protection for the population, then the international community is allowed to step in. And that comes in with the diplomatic pressure. We know that Ethiopia is in need of money, so that shouldn't be too difficult to put the pressure on, but it can go further into sanctions, and it can also end up with military intervention. That's the concept here. Now, of course, states are very reluctant here to actually go all the way down that route, but that route is possible. And when you look for a prosecutor, I think the prosecutor in this case should be the Security Council. The Security Council should take up the mandate again, with Iceland pursued a year ago. Perhaps Switzerland could do that and play that role here, and to push the question. So to start a process on R2P responsibility to protect, that would help monitor and stabilize perhaps the situation. Certainly ensure that the food supplies are coming. We looked at the that's also important after having watched the movie that I read in the World Food Programme that 430 megatons went to Tigray, which is food supplies for about 401,000 people here. And so I hope that this will further improve when the roads open, and an international monitoring on this here. Now, finally, on Ethiopia, which is now currently the problem. I assume that Ethiopia was informally invited to participate in this aggression by the federal government in the beginning here. By Eritrea, yes, sorry. Eritrea was invited by the federal government in Addis Ababa, or it was at least tolerated. But with the peace treaty, that's over. You can't have a peace treaty and allow Eritrea to continue the aggression. And that amounts to a violation of the United Nations Charter. Eritrea is violating Article 2.4 and allows, therefore, to counter this in self-defense. And so I think one should put the pressure again on the central government to actually push back Eritrea out of the country in reaction to this now continued aggression. I don't know what the Liberation Army plays for a role in this. I can't assess that. This is not accountable under international law because it's not the proper state. We have to work through central government in Addis Ababa, I think, on that. But I think with R2P, we have a concept which is not yet customary law, and countries are reluctant to use it because you step another on the toe. But the concept is there. It was adopted by the United Nations in 2005, mainly in response to Biafra and other difficulties we had. And I think this is a concept which you can really apply in this particular situation to put the pressure on Ethiopia to stop nasty activities and to actually start supporting the population again in the northern regions. So much. Thank you.
Many thanks, Thomas, for this very good legal assessment. It's really good to know that there are legal ways to prosecute, but ultimately it's also a political question and the question of political willingness to do so, right? And that's the big challenge. But without further ado, I would like to move on to our last speakers who are online, Paul Slovic and Scott Slovic. Let's see. Paul, can you hear us?
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, we see you. And you also have some slides, I guess, huh?
Yes, can you see those slides? They're on my screen, but I don't know if they're being shared.
I'm not sure. We don't see them yet, but
so the question is, how do we share those? Maybe do I have to hit share screen?
Yes.
We see.
Let me go to the Zoom. Just a second here. I have to rejoin the
We
Zoom.
see something there on the other side, but can you?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Just a second here. I should.
I mean, it's
okay. So
can you switch the screen? It's online now, but we don't see it yet. Ah, yes, now it's there. Thanks.
Okay. Can you let me get my slides here. I have to now find those slides.
No, the slides, we see them. It's fine. They're visible here.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Good. Slowly we'll get those. So you see that slide. Okay. Now can I move it? Just a second here.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Okay, good. So so my title is The More Who Die, the Less We Care. Confronting Genocide and the Deadly Arithmetic of Compassion. And this is my my second slide, which is a picture of the man who created the word genocide after World War II and spent his life trying to get people to care about it. And he says, why is a man punished when he kills another man, yet the killing of a million is a lesser crime than the killing of an individual? And that's a key element of the psychology here that we have to overcome. Now I'm okay. So the problem is that we are incoherent psychologically in our valuation of life, whether it's human or non-human life. We value individual lives greatly, but these lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis. As a result, we do too little to protect life in the face of genocide and other mass atrocities and other catastrophic that should be threats to humans and nature. Catastrophic episodes of killing, as in genocides, are all too common. They create an immense toll of suffering and death, often with little notice or resistance from the outside world. Most of them, unlike Ukraine and Russia, most of these atrocities are invisible. So after World War II, we said never again will we allow a genocide like the Holocaust to occur. And I see my slides are moving automatically here. Okay. Go to if someone's moving these, please come to the next slide. Okay, so there's three psychological obstacles to caring and action here. Scott and I call this the deadly arithmetic of compassion. They're called psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, and a biased decision-making provenance effect. I'll explain them briefly. Next slide, please. So the problem is that most of the time we deal with these issues through our feelings, through our emotions, rather than doing statistical analyses like Jan Nyssen so eloquently showed us early on. And when we're relying on our feelings, the problem is that our feelings that can't count. Saving one life is hugely important. We call it singularity effect. Saving two lives doesn't seem twice as important as saving one. And these feelings don't add, they don't multiply. Next slide. So this is illustrated by a man who was concerned, a famous scientist who was concerned about nuclear war. And he says, I am deeply moved if I see one man suffering and would risk my life for him. Then I talk impersonally about the possible pulverization of our big cities with 100 million dead. I am unable to multiply one man's suffering by 100 million. Well, that's if you're relying on feelings, you can't multiply. But we can do that if we use another aspect of our brain that does analysis, does the math. So opposite this singularity of the single victim is psychic numbing. Illustrated, for example, in Rwanda, 1994, where 800,000 people were murdered in 100 days. The world watched and did nothing. This is very typical where the world does not intervene. Next slide, please. So important questions. How should we value the protection of human lives? And how do we value the protection of human lives? Next slide. So here's an example to what we call normative models, ways that we might want to behave. One is if every life is intrinsically of equal value, as the number of lives at risk increase, the importance of saving those lives or protecting them should increase, like in a straight line. It's simple addition. In some cases, as on the right of this figure, if we're nearing the threshold where the further lives lost will lead to genocide, then they're even more important to protect than the previous ones, and the curve tips upwards. But this is the should question. Let's look at the do question in the next slide. So, because our actions in the face of these threats don't follow these normative models, because our feelings don't do this kind of analysis. They're insensitive to large losses of life. Next slide. So here's what it looks like in a graph. On the left, you see that going from 0 to 1 life is very important. You see a big steep rise. 2 is not twice as high as 1, and then suddenly it flattens out. Once the numbers get bigger, we don't have a differential reaction to them with our feelings. But it's even worse than that. On the right, you see that in some cases, as the number of lives at stake increase, the feelings collapse and we don't feel anything. Next slide. So another problem with our feelings is a sense of inefficacy, that if we can't solve a problem, if we think that what we do doesn't matter, the problem's too big and we're too small. There are ways to combat that once we recognize this, and we might talk about that later. Next slide. Prominence effect is another reason. Basically, this is an issue of attention. Next slide, please. If we're thinking about as a government acting to save foreign lives who are being killed, we also are concerned about our issues related to our own national security, and we thinking about balancing these to decide to act. But our attention is limited, and we focus more on security than humanitarian objectives. Next slide, please. So it's like our attention is limited. It's focused on security, and the human costs basically are invisible and don't weigh into those decisions. Next slide. So a brief summary and conclusions. We're inconsistent and often incoherent in the way we value human life. We value individual lives greatly, but these lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis. As a result, we do too little to protect these lives in the face of large threats, and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of our feelings in our reasoning processes is a necessary first step towards valuing lives humanely and improving decisions. Next slide. I think, yeah. So Scott and I have created this website, The Arithmetic of Compassion, to discuss the science behind overcoming indifference to genocide, and we give a lot of examples of this. Scott will talk about this next. So it's arithmeticofcompassion.com. Thank you, and over to Scott.
Thank you. I'm also going to try to share my screen now.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. I'm directly handing over to Scott.
And let's see. Here are my slides. Very good. In a way, I'm going to try to briefly talk about the other side of the psychological coin. Paul, in his comments, emphasized various forms of insensitivity to information, essentially, information, particularly in the context of humanitarian and environmental crises. So what can be done to put a face on these crises, and in particular, as it relates to Tigray, how to put a face on an invisible genocide? And so one of the key elements to keep in mind from the perspective of communication of information is the power of singularity. This happens to be an image from the Arithmetic of Compassion website and a particular blog entry that we have on offering testimony related to Tigray. Just a second, it's not advancing. So why combine an explanation of the psychological aspects of the Arithmetic of Compassion with a focus on how to communicate this information? And can we use an understanding of these cognitive processes that Paul was talking about somehow to improve communication efforts when it comes to various forms of humanitarian and environmental crisis? I think this angle or this issue might be of particular value to journalists like Christian and Samuel and others who have special access to information about crises such as what's going on in Tigray. First of all, an understanding of the psychological aspects of this may help us to recognize and push back against our own insensitivity to information. When we're bombarded with information, we may not quite understand what's going on in our own minds, but if we have these principles of psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, and the prominence effect, among some others, we might be able to resist those tendencies toward insensitivity. Also, inherent in the psychological understanding are various communication strategies, including what we call singularity and scalar imaginary, that might enable us to better understand what others are doing when they're communicating with us, and also how to share information that we have in order to communicate more effectively. So psychic numbing, as you just heard, is that the idea that we're quickly overwhelmed by numbers larger than one. And this leads to a tragic insensitivity to large-scale phenomena, even phenomena that are not intrinsically large. Just already at 2, we begin to lose sensitivity. And then transscalar imaginary is this idea that through certain communication methods, we can train our readers or our viewers to move psychologically or cognitively between the large and the small scales. So the figure that Paul showed is really very disturbing because it shows how quickly our sensitivity diminishes. But actually, the same figure displays part of the solution in the fact that we are highly sensitive to the number 1 or to individual lives. So you can see that the media have intuitively understood the need to overcome namelessness and facelessness in communicating various types of crises, such as this image that was very famous early in the war in Ukraine of Mariana Podgorskaya, the pregnant mother who was in the maternity hospital in Mariupol that was bombed. And by using her name and this particular image of the mother in her pajamas and the newborn baby, vividly portrayed the humanitarian crisis resulting from that war. Likewise, last summer, after a terrible shooting in a public school in Texas, the actor Matthew McConaughey gave a speech at the White House in Washington, D.C., and was showing images, faces, because of the poignancy, the moving emotional aspect of faces, images, and stories in order to overcome psychic numbing. So in our effort to overcome psychological tendencies toward insensitivity by communicating multidimensionally, using images, individualized stories, personalized faces, and by explaining some of these psychological processes and telescoping between the individual aspects of these crises and the broader kinds of information that we heard, the statistics from Professor Nyssen and his team. This telescoping multidimensional process is a very effective way of breaking through the psychology of insensitivity. Most of us are tragically incapable of moving between small scale and large scale, between the singular story and the collective crisis. That's why communicators such as Chris Jordan have been exploring various ways of achieving the trans-scalar imaginary. And on his website, chrisjordan.com, he actually shows a way of visually moving back and forth between the individualized examples and the many. This happens to be an image related to birds dying of pesticides, but he has many other crises that he attempts to convey in this trans-scalar fashion on his website. Paul mentioned that we have this website, arithmeticofcompassion.org, which emerges from our 2015 book, Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data. And one of the ideas highlighted on the website is narrative empathy, the idea that humans are particularly capable of feeling empathy when moved by the language of story. And we began to get a little bit of this in the comments on Tigray made by Christian and Samuel in their earlier comments, as they told stories of encountering particular individuals who had very moving narratives to offer. We started to feel something different about the entire experience of the conflict in Tigray than when we're simply getting huge numbers presented to us. So on this website, we now have more than 100 essays, interviews, and reviews highlighting the relevance of this psychology of compassion to both chronic and acute crises, such as the chronic crisis of childhood malnutrition around the world, and also the more acute, I hope, temporary crisis in Tigray. And there's this entry, Tigray, Testimony from Afar, that we published anonymously in order to protect names and families in Tigray, suggesting that the people who might present testimony are not only those who are actually direct victims of a crisis, but even by hearing the stories of family members in a war-torn area like Tigray, in telling that story, it might be possible to offer secondhand testimony that is a potent way of increasing public awareness and concern. So this particular blog begins with an explanation of the concept of testimony, and specifically the idea of secondhand trauma and secondhand testimony, such as the distress experienced by a family member whose relatives are trapped in a conflict zone. And this also explains, this introduction, how the singularity effect, focusing on individual cases, compels interest and concern among readers. There are various other blogs on the website that offer testimony in this way to display the power of individualized stories. And now to conclude, my main point is that what psychologists call the singularity effect suggests that we have the potential to overcome psychic numbing to a certain degree by revealing the individual stories within large-scale crises, such as the genocide in Tigray. And awareness of the trans-scalar imaginary enables writers and other communicators to move between the individual stories and information about the larger situation, which is vital to appreciating both the human dimension and the larger political aspects of the conflict in Tigray. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you very much. I think all these statements and presentations were very telling, and I'm really happy they showed everything from different angles to get a little bit the big picture. But when it comes to individual stories, I'm sure here in the audience, there are many of them. And I just wonder how many of you have relatives in Tigray? Many. And I think these stories matter. And we will not have time now because the talks took quite long. So we expected to have 20 minutes of discussion. But I guess you're all a little bit exhausted. So let's finish here and continue with our cultural evening. It was organized by the Tigrayan community. And please feel free to also donate. They brought all the food from their community. And I think it's great to end all this with such an event. Yeah.